Hey everyone, it's Javi here, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through the design process of creating an interactive date picker component. If you are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Javi, and I make weekly videos about product design skills, principles, and practices to help you build digital products and bring your ideas to life. If that sounds like something that you're interested in following for a weekly dose of design and code and everything in between, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. All right, so let's get to designing this date picker component. I'm going to jump straight into Figma here and show you just quickly what we are actually going to be designing today. So this is that date picker component that we're going to be making in this video. But before that, because we're talking design process, I just quickly wanted to share with you a minified version of how I am writing design specifications, typically at work as well. And here you can see essentially that specification for the exploration stage of this design. There is a problem statement, an objective, some success metrics, a couple user stories that help us shape what we're actually going to be designing, as well as some technical requirements to consider and other notes. I'm not going to go too much in depth on any of these in this video, but just so you know that they are here, they are important, and they help me shape what we're going to be doing within this exploration. So if we can just go to the top here and overview what actually the objective is of this exploration is we want to facilitate a new component that is going to allow developers building on Chakra, which is an open source component library that I'm working with, to introduce a better date picking experience in their applications. Full disclaimer, this does not mean that the team at Chakra is actively building a date picker component. This is simply an exploration of what such a component may look like in the future if pursued further. As much as I'm very specific about when to reason by analogy within a design process, because what we are building is a general purpose component for a component library, it's really important that what we end up doing in this exploration is conventional and familiar for most users that are going to be implementing this date picker. And so I put together an inspiration board that essentially gathers some of the date picking experiences that I've really liked and that are standard across many products. So here you can see that inspiration board as well as a couple things that I liked about each. And then within each of these is actually a link to the original inspiration. So I'm going to leave that in the file. So if you want to have a look at those, they are there as well. These are not here to offer any justification to any design decision that we will be making throughout this process of designing this date picker component. However, they are here to help us become more familiar with what is already out there, what are their standards when it comes to date picker components, and what end users are already used to using when it comes to other popular software and applications. Based on this inspiration board and the patterns that I could see, I put together a list of principles that is also aligned with our user stories, just to make sure that when I was designing this date picker component, there would be a series of things that I made sure that this date picker component would be able to fulfill for us. And as you can see, some of those would be, for example, like support single selection and date range, easy to navigate different months and years, support for 2-month view, shortcuts, and then there's a couple of things as well that are specifically tied to this being a component within the Chakra component library. And that includes principles like making sure that we integrate with the form control component to facilitate text input, being able to support the Chakra dark styles that are already embedded within the library, and so on, right? So as I was going through this design process, I wanted to make sure that the exploration would cover this set of principles. And just to show you what I did here as part of this design process, I didn't actually start by creating a component and then all the different variants. I actually wanted to keep it a little bit more freeform just so I could see how I could go from a very simple date picker component with just 1 month in view and take that all the way throughout all the principles that I had enlisted. And so this is why you can see here that there's a bunch of boards where I'm actually exploring a simple date picker, and then I'm showing you what happens if I were to, for example, click on this button right here to toggle all the years. And then I could take you now to the 2-month, which was a natural progression, right? Since I had created that first month view Now I could have the 2 months, and then I could show you what the base component looks like with disabled dates. And this is essentially what helped me understand basically all the variants of this one component that I wanted to build. And just seeing them all in different boards helped me also understand the overall structure of the component itself and how to create it afterwards within Figma. So this was incredibly useful. Here you can see, for example, I added some action buttons here at the bottom and explained them in the 2 different views. Here you have some date ranges and so on, right? So this process of just exploring how the component would fit across different variants gave me a sense of the structure. And then once I had that in place, I went on and created a date picker component starting from the very first one here, and then essentially including every single one of them within a component variant, so that whenever I am creating this component within my UI, I have access to all the reasonable variants here that I could just toggle on and off, right? So here I could show you, for example, there's one for actions, one for 2 months, shortcuts, and basically all of them are essentially compatible. So that is the date picker component. And what we're going to do now is recreate the most complex component version, just because once you're able to design that one, then all the others should come in very easily, because you're just going to have to simplify that format. And so we're going to design this one. So I'm going to introduce actions, 2-month view, shortcuts, year, and maybe disabled we don't need, maybe year we don't need. How about let's do this one right here without the years, but actually having the disabled state for the dates there. So this is the one that we're going to make. So I'm going to actually take this over here to the right, and we're just going to recreate it piece by piece. All right. So the first thing that I did here is actually create a component that is nested within this one, which is going to be the date component. And by that, I mean every single one of these little dates here. This is a date component, as you can see, that has specific states based on whether it is active or it is default or disabled or part of a date range and so on. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and just start off something here, even though I could just also bring this component right here and show this to you. So we can reference this every now and then, but I think it's just healthy if we also just do it here on our own. So let's go ahead and just create a 32 by 32 frame. And this is what's going to be the frame for our date component. And now we can call this, I'm going to call it new date, just to make sure we can differentiate it from the existing one. And I'm going to do Command-Alt-K to create a component out of this. And now essentially what we want to have within this frame is a text label that is going to host the text that we want to have as the date. So I'm just going to tap on 1, and that should be good. And as you can see, if you are wondering what these text styles are that I already have loaded in my file, these are the Chakra UI theme styles that I've introduced in this file. They're not available for public use yet, but they will be very soon. So just bear with me that these are actually styles that I've already introduced, but it shouldn't be too bad if you don't have them yet, because we're using very simple styling for this component. And I think I'll be sharing this file anyway sometime later this week with these theme styles as well, so you can have them. So I think we're going to go with small here, and then we're just going to change this fill here of our font color to this gray 800, I think it was. So there's that. Now, in terms of the alignment of this, one little trick that I've done here is that just to make sure that it's always in the center of this frame, I just grabbed the borders of this text and made sure that they were on the edges of the frame. And that way, it doesn't matter how big this is or how small it is. It's not like we're going to change the size, but anyway, just make sure that whatever number we are introducing here, it's always going to be centered within this frame. So that is one way to go about it. Now, an important piece about this new date component that I learned halfway through the exploration when I was designing this is that, as you'll notice, we're going to want to have a couple states for this date component that have to do with having always like some sort of background, right? So for example, in this one, I am using this light gray to tell you that this is the today date, right? So this, for example, was yesterday, and I was designing on April 11th, and I wanted the 11th to give me a little bit of context visually to tell me, hey, this is where you currently are today within this calendar. And so there's this, for example, but there's also, let me show you here, we can actually change the state to, for example, hover, and this would be the hover state. And we could change it also to active, and this would be the active state. And if this were to be part of a range, you could get an idea that also there are different kinds of designs here for how, depending on if the date is within like the beginning or the end of a range, we are also going to be making some adjustments to the background as well. And one thing that was pretty important in the beginning that I missed to note is that this background is actually a little bit smaller in scale than the frame size itself, right? So you can see there's a little bit of spacing, there's 2 pixels on each side, and this applies for most of the designs here, most of the states. So even, for example, if I am in, let's say, the middle of a range, right, then this is going to be giving me full edge to edge, right? Because we want the ranges to be connected. But when it comes to the top and bottom, you can see it still preserves that 2 pixel spacing. And the reason for it is that if you look at the way that we've designed this component, you can see that all of these dates have no spacing in between them, right? So if we were to actually not have any spacing at all, these backgrounds would interconnect. They would be clashing or just at the border of each other. And this would make it harder for the user to be able to read and select different dates across the calendar. So in order to fix that, what we did is we introduced the spacing internally within the component itself. So for example, if I have a range that goes from multiple weeks, let's say, here I could change this also to middle and assume that this range is going from like one line to the other. Now you can see that if I zoom out a little, there's not going to be that clash because we have the spacing built in. And so that is one consideration that we have to make when we are designing this date component. And we're going to be calling this layer the background. So let's come here, let's change this to background, and we're good to go. Now it's important that even though we're not going to be resizing this component, I still like to make sure that our constraints are properly set up. So this would theoretically be left to right, top to bottom kind of thing. And now we can simply, because we are generally going to have this, I think, circular. So here, for example, we can walk you through the states, right? So this state right here is hover. And in this case, we have a fully circular rectangle. And it has a border of gray 200. Then this one is the today, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, we set today to true. This is today with hover. And then this one, for example, is active when we've selected the date in a single select. If I go back to the date picker here, we can safely say that this default can be 9999 for a full border radius, and that should be good to go. Now, in terms of setting this up, I think I'm just going to simply give it a white background since we are not going to necessarily need this background from the very start. And then just to show you really quick, again, the states, we're not going to redo all of them within this video just because it's really, really simple to set these up once you already have that background, because these are just differently designed styles for that same container. So if you just follow along these, you should be fairly within line of having all those states. And the other states that we have here are essentially the disabled state, which is just a 50% opacity of the base state right here. And then when it comes to the date range, it gets a little bit more tricky. So as you can see, we have date range design here for if, for example, the date is in the middle of the date range. So as mentioned earlier, we want to go full edge here, left and right, and then leave spacing at the top. So in this case, what I did is I took the background layer and I extended it left and right, and then I just made sure to remove the border radius. And then the beginning and the end of a date range are very similar to the active state in the single select. The main difference is that here, as you can see, I added another background layer here called range, just to show you essentially that this is the beginning of a date range. So as you go from that one, it's going to be selected, and then the date range rectangle starts, right? So from that date right there. So if we were to, for example, take the date picker, and actually let's take that component and edit it a little bit just to show you how that works in action. If you would want to, for example, emulate a date range from, let's say, Monday to Friday, I could just take this 12 here in the beginning and make sure I have the right layer selected. And as you can see here, I have all the toggles that I need. So I can go straight to range here, and instead of none, I'm going to mark it to start. And then automatically this will change to the active state with the range in start. And as you can see, this is the state that we wanted here. And now we can say, okay, I want to have Friday be the end of the range. So we would go to range and set it to Friday. And there we go. And now we can take all these ones in the middle and change the range to middle. And now, as you can see, we have a perfect date range selection from the 12th to the 16th. It gets a little bit more interesting if you consider that, for example, let's say you have a date range that goes from 1 week to another. Then you have to make extra considerations. And that is why I designed these ones here, which are not actively selected, but they are part of the date range. And that is what I called here beginning of week and end of week. So let's say I'm in this date picker and I want to go from the 12th to the 21st. What I would do is I would deselect this one. So I'm going to change this. Actually, this will be in the middle now. And I'm going to change this also to middle, not state, but range. And now this one is within range, but it's also the end of the week. So I'm going to change the range to end of week. So now, as you can see, the only layer that we have here is the original background layer, but I just made sure to adjust the border radius so that it's only on the two sides on the right, just so I get this effect right here for the way that the border radius works. And now I can continue from the 19th. So I would change this now, make sure we got the right layer selected, and I would change the range to beginning of the week. And then let's say we want to finish off on the 22nd. So I would make these middle, and then I would select the 22nd and set it to end of the range. So now, as you can see, we have another perfectly selected date range from the 12th to the 22nd. Now, the last edge case that I wanted to cover here for the date range selection is, let's say that we have a 2-month date picker component with 1 month on the left and 1 month on the right. And it's quite typical sometimes that the application will want to provide this kind of interface design in the case that it is common for the user to select a date range that goes from 1 month to the other. Like, for example, if you're doing any kind of reservation for a semi-long-term stay, you're going to want to allow the user to easily be able to select a date range that scatters across multiple months, right? So in that case, what I did is, let's go ahead and actually duplicate this, just so we leave that one in view for reference. And I'm going to reset all overrides to start off fresh on this component. Let's select the 2-month view. And let's say now that what we want to do is set up a date range that goes from the 27th of this month to, let's say, the 5th of May. How would we go about that? Well, with what we know so far and what we've created so far, we would say, okay, the 27th would be the start of this range, and the 5th would be the end of the range, right? So I would go and select those. And now everything in between would be part of that date range. So we can start off by selecting the ones that are sort of in the middle and not beginning or end of weeks. So we can make this quite fast. So this would be middle. This would be, in this case, the beginning of a week. This would be the end of the week. And then here we would say that these are all in the middle. And you could say that, so let's change that to the middle. You could say that, okay, this is theoretically not the end of the week because it's Friday and there's still a couple days to go, even though they're part of a separate month. But you could theoretically make this the end of the week, let's say. So this could be one approach where I say, okay, I want the 30th to end there. And I would want this date range here to, let's say, start within the first of the month. And if you have this in place, I would say it's pretty good. But at the same time, because they are both closed, it feels a little bit disconnected, right, for this 2-month date range selection. And so what I did is I added an additional component called range gradient. And I sneakily added that. So let's undo those two actions there. So I do want to have them be in the middle still. I added one component here that is disabled at the end of the month called range gradient. And what this component essentially is just a linear gradient that is happening at the end of the month on the left and the beginning of the month on the right. And so what we can do is I could say, I want this range gradient to be active here. And so you can see there's this very light gradient going from left to right with our range color. And I could come back here to May as well. And if you look through the layer structure, you should be able to find a range gradient one that's hidden. And actually, this is the incorrect one. We have to change this to beginning of month just to make sure we have the direction of the gradient in the place that we want it to. And now you can see that it's a little bit more intuitive because it's giving me the impression that the date range doesn't actually end in April and it doesn't really start in May. And it's just a way to make them feel a little bit more interconnected. Okay, so now that I showed you a little bit about how that works, I think I could just take you through a little bit more of the design process behind actually trying to recreate one of these. So what we would do is I would take this component right here, and let's assume that we have all the states that we want. Essentially, the next step is just to create a grid of these date components, and I don't want to bother you with my copy pasting. And there we go. We have our grid set up here with a bunch of date components, and then also here a weekday component with the first 2 letters of each day of the week. And so what we can do now, I would say, is just grab all of this, and we can do Command-Alt-G to create a frame around all of this, and we can call this our grid. Now, let's talk a little bit about the top part here of our date picker. This part's interesting because we can do a little bit of reusability with components that we already have. And in this case, what I use is the button component from Chakra. So I'm just gonna tap into my components here and grab this button, and I'm gonna drop it right about here. And what we're gonna do is essentially give it a little bit of a variant change. So instead of it being a solid, I wanted to have it a ghost variant so it has no background. And then we're gonna give it a right icon, because what we're gonna do next is actually change the ID here from React.js to arrow down S line, I think that is. I tried with the drop-down one from Remix Icon as well, but it was a little bit too tiny. So I just left it as it was here with the normal drop-down. And then instead of having an 8-pixel spacing between them, I set it to 4. So it feels a little bit closer. And then in terms of the text styling, I don't need this to be this small and this bold. So we can actually change the styling here to medium, and I'm gonna bring it up to 14 pixels. And there we go. Now let's just roughly align it here for now. The other piece that we want to have is these 2 arrows here that are basically going to allow the user to easily browse between the months. So again, this is one of the principles that we had in the beginning of this video that we wanted to make sure that we covered. And we can leverage also another component that we already have, which is the icon button. And what's cool about this is that when you are going to be facilitating this design to your team, let's say if you wanted to build this component on your own, if you are using these reusable Chakra components, then it's going to be that much easier for your development team to know how to build this at speed and scale. So let's actually change this a little bit. I don't want this to be solid, so we wanted to have it a ghost design here for our button. And then in terms of the icon, we're going to have arrow left. And then I'm just going to make sure that we align these. They are both the same height. And now I want to have an 8-pixel distance between the left and right. And I'm going to change this icon to arrow right. So there we go. Now we have our selection here. And now I'm going to place this right about here for now. Now what we can do is I'm going to combine these two buttons inside an auto layout. Why not? And I'm going to call it, let's say, control buttons. And now I'm going to also combine it in a frame with this one. We can call this top controls. So now we have that as well. And I think at this stage we are at a good place to start doing a wrapper around this maybe. Yeah, why not? So I'm gonna just hold my F key and then just create a frame around it, and it should automatically wrap everything inside a frame. Don't worry too much about the spacing at the moment because we're gonna do some adjustments. I'm gonna change the border radius to 6, which is the radius size that we are universally using across our design here, also for these buttons. And I'm gonna make sure to change the fill to something that is recognized by our developers as a style in our theme to white. Okay, great. So it's getting there, right? So the other thing that we have to do now is, well, we can actually cheat a little bit and make sure that the width is already in place. So that's pretty good. And now we simply have to start working out the rest. So the spacing between the grid itself and the upper area here is 12 pixels. So let's go ahead and do that. So there we go. Now what we can do next is set up the second month view, and we can do that simply. Let's start off by just changing this to April 2021. Don't worry too much about the dates here being different on the 2 months at this stage. We just want to make sure we have a nice mock, and I think this would be 24 pixels in between. So it's a little bit more than on the sides on purpose, just to help on that readability, to make sure that there's no confusion between looking at one calendar or the other. So we have April and we have May 2021, and that should be good to go. One thing I'm divided on at this stage is whether both of these months should actually have this browsing capability. I've seen other designs where actually, if you are in the month on the left, these are removed from view, just so that you can use one universal control here for both months. So that could be the case. I'm just going to leave it here for now because it does not hurt, but just so you know, that is one consideration that each developer could then make when they are implementing this component. So I believe that now we can take this and put it at the right margin at the top, so that's 16 by 16, so following our 8 pixel grid there, looking sharp. And now for these action buttons here, they're going to be the same width as the calendar on the right. And so what we're going to do is start off by just leveraging our existing button component again. And I'm going to just do some simple adjustments to the variance here to get it to where we want it to be. So I believe this is medium. We can have this be a solid variant. We don't need any icons. And I'm just going to drag it here to the edge of the calendar margin here with 16 pixels. And now in terms of getting this to be a primary style, we don't have them defined in our Figma file, but we can do it quite easily through the styling here. So I can simply say, okay, this background is going to be gray 700. Is that right? Gray 800. It's gray 800. And now if I hold my command key, it will just automatically select this text style here, and I can change this to white, which is the style that we are using for the text layer within the button itself. Okay, great. So we have the first button. We can call it done. And don't worry about the width at the moment. We're going to tackle that through an auto layout just in a second. I'm going to duplicate this by holding my Alt key. We want to have 12 pixel spacing between the two. And I'm going to change this now to be a more of a secondary action here, so not as important as done. We're going to change this to, I think it is gray 100. Yep. So gray 100 for the background, which is going to be right about here. And now the text style within it is going to be gray 700, just like our date component text styles. So let's go ahead and do gray 700, and I'm going to mark it as clear. Okay, so we have these buttons here, and we could do that manual resizing just to get it pixel perfect. But there's an easier way to go about it. You can actually select both of these. You do Command-Alt-G to put them inside a frame. And now we're just going to resize it to make sure that it is the same width as the calendar at the top. So I think that is 224. So let's just do that through the width adjustment here. And now we can align them to make sure they are pixel perfect. And now what you essentially want to do is set this up as an auto layout. So I'm going to do my Shift A in order to get that going. And well, now unfortunately it changed the width again because it auto adjusted to the objects that it had inside the frame. But we can easily do this again. And we can set this while we're at it to right and bottom. So there's that. And now what we want to say is essentially, please keep a 12 pixel distance between the two buttons. But what we want to do now is we want both of these to be able to fill the container within them, right? So if we do it for one, you can see that it's going to have the sort of awkward imbalance. And that is because we haven't done fill container for the other one yet. So if we set both to fill container, you will see that automatically both are going to fill all the way until the point they are symmetric. And the only thing that's going to separate them is that spacing that we manually defined in the auto layout. So that's a very easy way for us to just make sure these are pixel perfect in place. Okay, so actually let's leave this to the top here for now, or we can even just move this already. So we just have to make sure we get the height here. So this is 348 for the height. So let's go ahead and do that. But the problem that we have here is that because I was lazy and we don't actually have this extra date for May, this is actually going to be a little bit shorter in height. So essentially what we want to get to is make sure that we have this 16 pixel spacing also at the bottom. So right now it's 48. So one little trick to easily do these adjustments where you know where you want to get to with that adjustment is go to your height and say, I want to reduce 48 pixels, but then I want to add 16, and then it's going to perfectly fall into place. As you can see, we have 16 pixels on the sides. Okay, great. So the last thing that we have to do is this sort of shortcuts area on the side. This will be very easy because all this is a frame that is created within this frame of the date picker component. And we can just make sure that this is the right adjustment here. So I think we have 16 pixels to the side here with respect to the left calendar. And now we can just make sure to set the constraints just for reference to top and bottom. We can rename this frame to shortcuts. And while we're at it, we can also rename this to actions and start cleaning up a bit our layer structure. So this looks pretty good. And now we can also change this to date picker. And now when it comes to setting up the inner components, all that I did is set up a couple of text styles here. As you can see, we have a text layer here for today, which is our first shortcut. And essentially the whole idea around these shortcuts, by the way, is that sometimes your application will have some common selections that users will want to make use of all the time. And this could be, for example, if you want to have a specific selection of today or yesterday or a date range of this week or the last week. So we want to provide those easily accessible within the left side. So it's the thing that they first see when they open the date picker. So instead of actually having to select a date within the calendar, they can just easily read what's on the left and then pick the selection they want without having to browse the complexity of the grid of numbers. So this can be quite handy in the case that you have these sort of common patterns for the way that your users are handling the date selection, right? So I'm not going to go too complex here. I'm going to just make sure we have like a couple more. So this week, last week, that should be good to go. And then the last piece is setting up this border here on the right side. I'm just going to copy paste that here. And what this is essentially, we need to make this a little bit tinier in terms of the height. So this is a 16 pixel on the top and 16 on the bottom, just following the margins that we have defined for every other thing inside the date picker. And as you can infer, this is a rectangle with a 1 pixel width. and it has our common style here for border of gray 200. And this is just to make sure we have a little bit of a separation between these two things. And as you can see, the constraints are set to right and top and bottom, just to make sure that if for any reason we have to resize this in the future, it will stay in place when moving this shortcuts area here. So if I now zoom out a little bit, you will actually see that we managed to entirely design the date picker experience here. And if you defined your date component appropriately, you should be able to go into any of these and set up these for, let's say, if you want to have this be like your today date, or if you want to change the state. And by the way, we can talk a little bit about that here within our component, just to let you know that there is a couple of interactive pieces to this component within this file. If you have interactive components enabled, which is right now in beta for Figma, you will be able to set up interactive design between different variants of your date. So just to show you what this actually looks like in a prototype version, we can come back here to date picker, and I think I can just open up this outcome frame inside a prototype screen. And just to show you really quick what that interactive state design looks like. So as you can see, if I were to do any kind of hovering over these dates, it's a little bit slow right now as I'm showing it to you, because I'm also doing a screen recording at the same time. But so you get the idea here, there's a little bit of a hover state. And if I were to click on any of these, it's going to turn on its active state. So it makes the number a little bit bolder, and it gives me this nice filled background. And if I were to click on it again, it will take me back to the base state. And that is basically it. So that was all for today. I hope that you enjoyed this video and the design process behind designing this date picker component. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to give this video a like to let me know that you like this kind of content. And as usual, please use the section down below with the comments in case there's anything you want to mention or talk about with regards to anything that we covered in this video. I hope you're well and stay safe, and I will catch you in the next one.